not. The descendants of Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, as they begin to multiply upon the face of the earth according to the command of God, they begin to divide into nations, and several of these nations migrate eastward into the plains of Shinar, and there they begin to build the Tower of what? Tower of Babel. They congregate together, and they have the technology of brick and mortar, and they begin to build mighty walls around themselves, and they have intentions of building these towers so high that they become their own salvation. They become their own protection. They become their own deliverance. And God looks down upon that, and He says, I am God, and you are not. And He comes down, and He confounds the languages. They wake up one morning, and they can't understand each other. And the nations are dispersed from that place. And it is precisely in the closing out of chapter 11 and the opening of chapter 12 that a major shift in God's dealing with man takes place. From Genesis 1 all the way through the end of chapter 11, God is dealing with the nations at large. But when we see the opening of chapter 12, God turns away from dealing with the nations that He has already judged, that He has already confounded. God turns away from dealing with the nations, and Melissa, He turns and He begins to deal with one man. In fact, the entire rest of the book of Genesis from chapter 12 through chapter 50 is the record of God's dealing with Abraham and his descendants. I want you to think about the use of God's name here in relation to Abraham. As God comes to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, then the Lord, that is Jehovah, said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those that bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God has suddenly turned from dealing with the nations to now dealing with one man and one individual, and He appears to that man by the name of Jehovah. And He calls, and I think we have a tendency to look at Abraham as this righteous man that kind of stood head and shoulders above everybody else around him. But Abraham was a pagan idolater just like everybody else when God came to him and called him out of Ur of the Chaldees. God comes as Jehovah, and He makes a covenant with Abraham, and He tells Abraham, I'm going to give you a city, I'm going to give you a land, I'm going to give you descendants, and because of you, all of the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Moving rapidly through the rest of the narrative of Genesis, God renews this covenant with Abraham's son Isaac. He continues this covenant with Abraham's grandson Jacob. And the book of Genesis closes out with all of the descendants of Abraham going down into Egypt because of a great famine. And there, because of God exalting young Joseph, the great-grandson, great-grandson of Abraham, God exalted him to a high position in Egypt and sustained His people. They go down to Egypt, and the book of Genesis closes out. But as we see the opening of the narrative in the book of Exodus, we see a completely different picture. Joseph has died, and the Pharaoh who exalted Joseph has died, and the people of Israel have multiplied so greatly that the Pharaoh that is in power then now begins to fear them. And he enslaves them and forces them to build and make brick and fire brick in his kilns for his pyramids and his buildings and the expansion of his kingdom. Which brings us to the text of Exodus chapter 3. Moses is still a young man. He has seen the oppression of his people in Egypt. He even killed an Egyptian who was contending with one of his brother Jews. And he had to flee to the backside of the Midian desert. And one day when he's walking through that desert, Dalton, he walks past and there's this bush over there that's just burst into flame. And the flames and the smoke are licking at it and rising up, but the bush is not being consumed. It's not being burned up. So he turns aside, and as you well know, he has an encounter where he comes face to face with God. God tells Moses, I'm going to use you to deliver my people out of Egypt. I have heard their cries. I have seen their oppression. I am going to deliver them. I'm going to bring them out with a mighty hand, and you are going to be my instrument to lead them out. Of course, immediately Moses begins to say, oh Lord, I'm not capable of this, and he begins to make excuses. But God doesn't let him off the hook, as you well know. And then we come down to chapter 3, verse 13. Pay careful attention to the words here. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am sent me. I am sent me. I want you to think about what God is communicating here. First of all, Moses said, when I go to the people and they say, the God of your fathers has sent me, who would the Israelites have connected this God with? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. That was their fathers. But guys, I would submit to you, if they were familiar with Genesis chapter 2, they would not have just traced this God back to their father Abraham. They would have traced Jehovah God all the way back to Adam in Genesis chapter 2. He's saying the God of your fathers, that includes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the way back to Adam. And he says, when I come to them and I say this, they're going to ask me, what is your name? And God says, you tell them the I am has sent you. The I am has sent you. And here's where it gets very interesting. The verb in I am is the verb avah, which is the second part of the compound of Jehovah, which means, literally, means what? It means to exist. Now, you look at that and you say, okay, so Moses is supposed to tell them that the God who exists has come to deliver them. But wait. The verb, I am, is in the active voice. Meaning that the subject of the verb is performing the action of the verb. God tells Moses, you go tell Israel that the God who is self-existent has sent you. The God who is self-existent has sent you. The God who is existing, the God who is. God is saying, Harry, I exist by the virtue of my own power and my own essence. I am radically different than the gods of your oppressors. The gods of your oppressors are the sun, the moon, the created things. The God who has come to deliver you is the God who